My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 29 years old, and the last word my mother ever said to my face in public was unnecessary. She said it at my sister's wedding reception, in a ballroom built for 200 guests, while I stood there holding a champagne glass a waiter had put in my hand before I could refuse it. Why is she even here? This is unnecessary. That was her opening line after 8 years of never once calling me back. My sister turned around, saw me standing there, and smiled the exact way you smile at a wine stain on a rented tablecloth, not angry, just already calculating who'd have to pay for it. You weren't invited, she said. She was right about the guest list. She was wrong about almost everything else, because in about 40 minutes, the groom was going to stand up in front of 200 people, including 3 surgeons, a hospital board chair, and his own mother, and he was going to say my name into a live microphone. And what happened after that didn't just ruin a wedding. It ended a family's 30-year reputation, and I never once raised my voice. But this story doesn't start in that ballroom. It starts 8 years earlier, in a hallway with 11 picture frames on the wall, and 1 frame that was empty. Welcome back to the channel where the quiet ones finally get to talk. If you've ever been the family member nobody saved a seat for, stay with me, this one's for you. Drop a comment with the word frame if you know exactly what I mean, and hit subscribe before we go back to where this really started. 3 weeks before my sister's wedding, an envelope showed up at my house. Cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than my first apartment's electric bill. It was addressed to Dr. Nathan Cole and Mrs. Claire Cole. My husband gets invitations like this constantly: hospital galas, medical conferences, donor dinners. I almost didn't open it. I was thinking about payroll for my company, half distracted, using a butter knife because I couldn't find the letter opener. Then I read the names inside. The Hargrove family requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son, Dr. Ethan Hargrove, to Natalie Ashworth. Natalie Ashworth. My sister. I stood in my kitchen and read her name 4 times, like the letters might rearrange themselves into somebody else's name if I stared long enough. The tile floor was cold under my bare feet. Somewhere, a family that hadn't spoken to me in 8 years was planning a wedding, and an invitation with my married name on it had slipped straight through their filters, like a bird flying in through a window nobody remembered leaving open. My husband Nathan came in, read it over my shoulder, and set his coffee mug down very carefully, the way he does when he's deciding not to say the first thing that comes to mind. You don't have to go, he said. I know, I told him. That's not the same as not wanting to. He didn't push back. Nathan's a trauma surgeon. He understands the difference between a wound that needs stitches and one that just needs air to finally close on its own. We sat at our kitchen table that night and made rules, like we were running a board meeting instead of planning a family reunion. We'd go to the ceremony. Sit in the back. Congratulate the groom. Leave before anyone noticed the temperature had dropped 10 degrees the moment we walked in. I even picked out a plain navy dress. Quiet as wallpaper. I told myself I was walking in as a polite stranger. I was wrong about that in almost every direction, and the first sign of just how wrong showed up before I'd even finished my first glass of sparkling water. The wedding was held on a hillside estate outside the city, stone archways, chandeliers the size of bathtubs, ballots in gray vests, a string quartet tuning up under a pergola. My family always did know how to build a stage. Nathan got pulled into a circle of physicians near the bar almost immediately, which suited me fine. I drifted out toward the terrace with my quiet navy dress and an untouched glass of champagne, counting down the minutes until the ceremony would start and I could disappear into a back row seat. That's when I heard my mother's voice for the first time in 8 years. It came from the other side of a stone column, bright, polished, her hostess voice, the one she used on people whose approval mattered to her. 2 families of physicians, she was saying to someone. Can you imagine the grandchildren? A woman laughed. And then my mother said the sentence that knocked the breath out of me like a car door slammed on my hand. Natalie has always been remarkable. Our daughter, our only daughter, you understand. We poured everything we had into her. Our only daughter. I stood behind that column completely still, the way you go still when a wasp lands on your arm and you're trying not to provoke it. I had prepared myself, walking in, to be the estranged sister. The awkward footnote. The one who left. I had not prepared myself to be erased entirely. Erasure is tidier than hatred, if you think about it. Hatred leaves a mark. Erasure just leaves a blank space where a person used to stand. Somewhere in that crowd, my father was wearing an expensive suit and nodding along to everything, the way he always did. I looked down and saw my hand shaking around the champagne glass, and I made myself stop, because I had learned a long time ago, in front of these particular people, you do not let your hands shake. The quartet started a waltz. And behind me, moving closer through the crowd, was the voice that had taught me that lesson in the first place. To explain what happened next, I have to take you back to the hallway I grew up in. In my parents' house, there's a wall just past the front entry. 11 frames hang on it. My grandfather's medical degree. My mother's cardiology board certification. My father's anesthesiology fellowship. Cousins, great-uncles, a full century of doctors in mahogany and glass. We called it the wall. Capital W. The way other families say the lake house. Sunday dinners had a kind of liturgy to them. My mother would go around the table and ask each of us what we'd accomplished that week, and the answers got graded like lab results. My sister Natalie, 4 years older than me, always had numbers ready, class rank, test scores, science fair placements. She was the investment that paid dividends. I was the other kind of child. I could splint a bird's broken wing. I could redress my own grandmother's bandaged shin better than the visiting home nurse could. But I froze solid in academic competitions, and I brought home bumblebees I'd found dying on the sidewalk, setting them gently on the kitchen table like they were something worth saving. My mother never screamed about any of it. Screaming, in her mind, was for families without standards. She just quietly adjusted how much of her attention I got, the way you'd rebalance an underperforming stock. I don't think she believed she was being cruel. I think she genuinely believed the family name was collateral we'd all borrowed against, and that love was simply the interest payment due on that loan. Here's the detail I need you to hold on to, because it comes back at the very end of this story. The summer I turned 14, a 12th frame appeared on that wall, below Natalie's Honor Society certificate. It was empty. When I asked my mother what it was for, she smiled the way a loan officer smiles and said, "That one's yours. Pending. Now come with me to my high school graduation dinner, 10 years before that wedding." My mother booked the private room at her country club, which should have been my first warning, because the private room was reserved for announcements, not celebrations. 22 relatives. White tablecloths. A printed menu with my name at the top of it. I wore a yellow dress I'd paid for myself with money from my pharmacy job, and I remember feeling almost pretty in it, until my aunt looked me over a beat too long and said, "Well, aren't you brave with color?" My graduation was technically the occasion. Nobody told me there'd be a second act. Between the salad course and the entree, my mother stood up, tapped her glass, and announced that Natalie had been accepted into medical school, top choice, full scholarship, the works. The whole room rose to its feet like it had been rehearsed. My father toasted the next Dr. Ashworth. Someone's husband started talking residency strategy across the table. A waiter quietly set my dessert down in front of me while everyone else faced the opposite end of the table. For a few minutes, I sat there eating chocolate cake alone at my own graduation dinner, telling myself this was fine. This was simply how our family operated. Natalie's news genuinely was bigger, I understood that. I had my own plan, a certified nursing assistant course starting that September, with hopes of nursing school after, paid for on my own. I had the brochure folded up in my purse like contraband. Then my mother tapped her glass a second time. "And of course," she said, warm as a scalpel, "we should say something about Claire." Every face at that table turned toward me. My mother looked at me the way she'd look at an X-ray, and smiled. One daughter got into medicine, she told 22 relatives, tilting her glass toward Natalie. The other got. She let the paws do the rest of the work. Pauses were her scalpel too. An honest high school diploma is still a diploma. We celebrate what there is to celebrate. A few people laughed the hollow way people laugh at a boss's joke, quick, eyes down. My aunt mouthed something sympathetic at me across the table, which somehow made it worse. I sat there with chocolate on my fork and 18 years of training running through my spine, and I gave that room absolutely nothing. No tears. No exit. No scene for anyone to remember me by. I finished the cake. It tasted like drywall. Later that night, the family photos went up on the mantel. In the group shot from the club's front steps, I wasn't in the frame. Not cropped out, composed out. My mother had arranged the pose herself. When I asked her about it, she walked me over to the wall, tapped the empty 12th frame with one manicured finger, and delivered the family motto like a diagnosis. In this family, love is earned. This frame is waiting. What goes in it is up to you. I told her the frame could wait forever, then, because I wasn't going to medical school. I said it quietly. But I said it. She looked at me for a long moment, and something behind her eyes clicked shut like a cash register drawer. Then it will hang empty, she said. And everyone who visits will know exactly why. She went to bed. I stood alone in that hallway under a century of other people's achievements until the porch door creaked open behind me. Come sit with me, honey, said a voice. My grandmother Dorothy, everyone called her Da, was sitting on the porch swing in her cardigan, 2 glasses of iced tea already poured, because she always somehow knew. Dot was my mother's mother, which surprises people when I tell them. It surprised me too, once I was old enough to do the math on how a woman that warm had raised a daughter that cold. Dot had been a nurse for 4 decades, night shifts, wound care, the unglamorous end of medicine, while her husband, my grandfather, collected the framed degrees that started the wall in the first place. Heard the toast, did you? She said. It wasn't really a question. I sat down beside her, and the porch swing took my weight the same way it had since I was 6 years old. Then she did something she'd never done before. She unbuckled the steel watch from her own wrist, the nurse's watch, with the sweeping second hand she'd used to time 1,000 pulses over 40 years, and she buckled it onto mine. It was still warm from her skin. 40 years I wore that thing, she said. It's seen more people through the worst night of their life than everyone at that dinner table combined. And it never once asked a single one of them their class rank. I laughed and cried at the same time, which was the only kind of crying she ever allowed on that porch. Claire, she said, patting my hand, looking out at the dark yard like the rest of her sentence lived somewhere out there. Listen to me. Nobody earns love, honey. She stopped there. I wouldn't hear the rest of that sentence for a very long time, and not from her mouth. 10 months after that porch swing, that watch was the only thing I owned that my family couldn't take back. Because 10 months later, they threw me out of the house entirely. The college fund went first. $80,000, built up since the day I was christened, meant for whichever school would eventually take me. That spring, my father sat me down at the kitchen table with a manila folder and explained, in his calm anesthesiologist's voice, that the fund had been reallocated to cover Natalie's medical school tuition. An investment goes where the return is, my mother added from the doorway. Not cruelly. Just the way you'd read off a weather report. I want to be fair to myself here, I saw that particular storm coming, and I'd already started preparing for it. I was 19. I'd opened my own bank account the week after graduation. I'd pulled my documents out of my mother's filing cabinet one afternoon while she was at work. I'd finished my certified nursing assistant course at night, and I was already picking up shifts at a home care agency, helping elderly clients bathe and dress with whatever dignity the job could still offer them. I loved that work. Which, it turned out, was the one thing my mother could never forgive. She could have survived a daughter who failed on her way toward medicine. She could not survive a daughter who succeeded on her way towards something she considered beneath us. The actual ultimatum came on a Tuesday in April, at the bottom of the staircase, with my father very intently studying his own shoes. Quit the home care job. Retake my entrance exams. Get back on what my mother called the family trajectory. Or leave the house. She used that exact phrase, family trajectory, like we were a spacecraft that had drifted off course. I remember being strangely calm. I think some part of me had been rehearsing this moment for years without admitting it to myself. I packed everything I owned into 2 trash bags in about 40 minutes. My clothes. My CNA certification folder. Dot's watch, already on my wrist. Nobody helped me carry anything down the walk, and nobody stopped me at the door either. You're choosing to be nobody, my mother said as I passed her. I'm choosing to be somebody you don't get to grade, I told her. The porch light switched off before I even reached the sidewalk. My first client after I left home was a retired machinist named Mr. Delgado. 84 years old, hands like tree roots, a man who'd spent his whole working life rebuilding engines and now couldn't manage a shirt button on his own. The agency paid me $11 an hour to be his hands. I learned to shave a face that flinched at the razor. I learned to time his medications using the sweep of Dot's watch. I learned to listen to the same war story every single night with the same fresh attention, because for him, every night, it genuinely was fresh. My family would have called that work wiping strangers. Here's what it actually was: I held one man's dignity in my 2 hands for 8 hours a night, and I never once dropped it. I'd like to see a scalpel do that. I lived in a small studio above a laundromat and kept a spiral notebook of everything my agency did wrong: missed handoffs, double-booked aides, families left waiting on a phone that never rang back. Not out of spite. Out of the same instinct that used to make me rebandage my grandmother's bruised shin as a kid. When care is done badly, something in my hands just itches to fix it. I was 19, then 20, then 22, saving every spare dollar in a coffee can like it was still the Great Depression. And then, the fall I turned 23, my grandmother's phone went silent. Dot had a stroke on a Thursday in October. I found out 2 days late, from her next-door neighbor, because nobody in my family thought to call me. By the time I knew, she was already in hospice, on a restricted visitor list, and the person managing that list, as her medical power of attorney, was my mother. I did everything a person can legally do. I called the front desk every single day. I sent my name in writing, twice. I drove 2.5 hours on my 1 day off and stood at the reception counter in my work scrubs while a kind receptionist with terrible news already sitting in her eyes checked a clipboard and said, "Immediate family only, and I'm so sorry, you're not on the list." I was her granddaughter. On paper, in that building, I was nobody. And paper had always been my mother's home turf. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time, close enough to guess which window might be hers. 11 days later, Dot died. I found out about the funeral from the same neighbor, after it had already happened. There's a specific kind of quiet that follows a grief you weren't allowed to attend. It moves into your apartment and never pays rent. But Dot, being Dot, had managed to slip one thing past the clipboard. A week before her stroke, she'd left me a voicemail. 41 seconds long. I know it's 41 seconds because the screen tells me so, not because I've ever once heard it end. I pressed play the night I found out she was gone. Made it 12 seconds in. "Gracie, it's your grandmother. Don't you dare delete this." My thumb hit stop on pure reflex, because her voice was so alive, and I wasn't ready for the past tense yet. I kept that voicemail for 5 years. 5 years, and I never once let it play all the way through. Grief either buries you, or it pours a foundation. 6 months after we lost, I took $12,000 out of that coffee can and my credit union account, rented a 2-room office that shared a thin wall with a dance studio, and started my own home care agency. I named it Harbolite, for no family reason at all. I just wanted a name that sounded like the opposite of a hallway full of frames. My hiring policy fit on one line: hire the ones who show up. I took my old notebook, every mistake my previous employer had ever made, and turned every entry into a rule. Aides got fair wages and real backup coverage. Families got a callback within the hour, any hour I happened to be awake, which back then was most of them. My very first contract was small, a hospital discharge planner who was desperate on a Friday afternoon and out of better options, which honestly is the only way anyone hands a 23-year-old a real chance. We didn't lose a single client for 2 years straight. Word travels fast in the business of simply showing up when you say you will. 5 years later, Herbalife had grown to over 300 caregivers across 3 states, and I had a job title I still can't say out loud without hearing my younger self laugh at me. Founder and president. If you're watching this while you build something of your own out of a 2-room office somewhere, and everyone who shares your last name is calling it a phase, I want you to pause right here and hear me say this plainly: the people who wouldn't save you a seat are not the audience you're building for. If that landed for you, hit subscribe. The next part of this story is where all of it comes back around. Because one Tuesday, a hospital called about a patient nobody else would take, and the doctor on the other end of the line had a voice I'd end up hearing every single morning for the rest of my life. 2 years before that wedding, my old hospital contact, the trauma center where my husband worked, approached Herbalife with a proposal. They wanted to launch a geriatric medicine fellowship, training young doctors to actually understand what aging patients need after the surgery is over, and they needed a founding sponsor. The hospital board fully expected me to negotiate naming rights. That's the whole point of sponsorship, usually. I had one condition, and it wasn't my own name. I wanted it called the Dorothy Ashworth Fellowship, after a nurse who worked 40 years of night shifts and never once got a frame on anybody's wall. And my name would appear nowhere. Not in the press release. Not on the plaque. Not at the annual donor dinner. The hospital's development office assumed I was just being modest. My husband knew better, and he signed the paperwork alongside me anyway, listed only as physician liaison. I told myself, at the time, that it was about privacy. Standing where I stand now, I can tell you the truer version. Some part of me was still quietly building a case file for a jury that was never actually going to convene. Some invisible future day, in some invisible court, my family would finally see the company, the fellowship, my grandmother's name restored to something, and they would understand exactly what they'd thrown away. And they would come find me. Quiet auditioning is still auditioning. I just found a way to do mine anonymously, which let me call it dignity instead. The first Dorothy Ashworth Fellow was selected that spring, out of 40 applicants. A young internist with good hands and better manners, the kind of doctor who learns every caregiver's first name. He wrote me a thank you letter through the hospital foundation without ever knowing who I actually was. His name was Ethan Hargrove. I had funded a stranger's entire future and told absolutely no one about it. And that spring, that same stranger sent me a wedding invitation, because that stranger was marrying my sister. They thought they were quietly removing a problem before the Hargroves noticed anything was wrong. In reality, they were walking me straight across a ballroom that held my husband, my life's work, and exactly one person who knew precisely who I was, and every step they made me take was a step closer to the moment their entire stage came down. The side room smelled like lilies and floor wax. My father was already waiting in there, which told me the scene had been cast before the curtain even went up. Martin Ashworth, 61 years old, a man who'd spent 4 decades putting other people gently to sleep and 1 full decade doing something close to that to himself. For 8 years I'd told myself a small, comforting bedtime story about my father, that he was the gentle one, the hostage in all this, that somewhere under the good suit he still missed me. He looked at me now for the first time since the trash bags. "Here's the entire thing," he said. "Use the side corridor by the kitchen. There's a service exit. Don't make your mother repeat herself. Not how are you. Not you look well. Not even my name." I waited for something else. A flicker. Some folded $20 bill of affection he might slip me when nobody was looking. Nothing came. And I finally understood something it had taken me 8 years and 1 sentence to learn. His silence had never been a hostage's silence. It was a shareholder's silence. He'd voted with her at every single meeting. He'd just let her read the minutes out loud. "No," I said. He blinked, like the word was unfamiliar to him. "Maybe in that house, it was. I came through this family's front door once already carrying everything I owned in 2 trash bags," I told him. "I will never again leave anywhere through the back." My phone buzzed against my hip. A text from Nathan, 3 rooms away, still oblivious and about to become extremely relevant. "Ethan's asking where you went. He wants to introduce you to his mother." I didn't take the kitchen exit, and I didn't go straight back to the ballroom either. I found a small rock garden behind the terrace where the noise from the caterers faded into hedges, and I sat down on a cold stone bench in my navy dress. You already know which voicemail I opened. 41 seconds, backed up in 3 places, listened to 100 times, and finished exactly never. "Gracie, it's your grandmother. Don't you dare delete this." 12 seconds in, right on schedule, my thumb hovered over the screen. "And I need you to hear this, honey, because nobody ever told your mother." I stopped it again. Sat there with my pulse ticking under Dot's watch, her sentence cut off in the middle for the 100th time, and I asked myself what I was actually still doing at that wedding. I could slip out after the cake and keep the peace at a party I had every right to attend. Or I could sit exactly where my name card said I should sit, in a room this family had built on top of my erasure, and let whatever was true become true out loud. Dot walked through that family's front door in a nurse's cardigan for 60 years, and she never once apologized for the uniform. I put the phone away, stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked back toward the music, toward the ceremony's reception, the seating chart, and the 41 seconds I still owed my grandmother. Table 2. Groom's side. Family adjacent. Engraved place card, Dr. and Mrs. Cole. I watched, from across the room, as my mother picked up a printed seating chart and read it the way you'd watch someone find a lump. Her finger traveled down the calligraphy, stopped at table 2, and for half second I will treasure into old age, my mother lost control of her own face. Table 2 was sacred ground. Guests seated close enough to share a bread basket with the head table. You do not seat strangers there. You certainly do not seat the family's supposed embarrassment there. She looked from the chart, to me, to my husband, measuring him now, the good suit, the surgeon's posture, the way St. Anselm's colleagues kept stopping by our table to pay their respects, and I could see the machinery grinding behind her eyes. She had no idea who Nathan Cole was. That was the delicious, terrifying center of the whole thing. For 8 years she hadn't wondered about me even once, and now the answer was sitting at table 2 under engraved calligraphy, and she couldn't ask a single person without revealing that she didn't already know. Natalie found out faster. Brides always know their own seating chart by heart. I watched her cross the dance floor in her enormous gown, lean over the place cards, and turn the color of the tablecloth. She found me by the coat check a few minutes later, fingers wrapped around my wrist like a blood pressure cuff, and pulled me into the stone hallway with a bridal smile stretched thin over pure panic. "Whatever you told her," Natalie said, "you're walking it back. Right now." "I told her we grew up in the same town," I said. "Don't do the calm thing," she hissed. "You've had 8 years to ambush me, and you picked my wedding." I asked her the only question I'd actually come there to ask. "What did you tell them happened to me, Natalie? What's the story?" My sister, a bride of exactly 1 hour, looked me dead in the eye. "There is no story," she said. "You don't exist. As far as the Hargroves know, I'm an only child." I'd braced myself, walking into that estate, for smears. A dramatic villain edit, addiction, theft, scandal. The truth was so much simpler than that. They hadn't buried me. They'd never even bothered digging the hole. I was just an accounting entry that had quietly been dropped from the books. But here's what I actually noticed, instead of my own anger, because a decade of night shifts teaches you to read hands. Hers were shaking. Not wedding day nerves shaking. Hospice clipboard shaking. And her eyes kept flicking down the hallway, not toward our mother, but toward Ethan. A woman defending one lie is annoyed. A woman defending a lie stacked directly on top of a second lie is terrified. The ceremony itself was lovely, the way hotel lobbies are lovely. During the recessional, the professional part of my brain, the part that audits care plans for what's missing, started quietly itemizing that wedding the way it itemizes a chart. Item: the bride was supposedly a dermatologist about to open her own practice, yet in a garden full of physicians, not one guest on her side was introduced as a colleague. Item: her practice's grand opening this fall had no lease anyone could name a neighborhood for. Item: whenever a guest asked Natalie a direct medical question, and doctors ask each other that constantly at weddings, my mother materialized like security and answered for her, charmingly, every single time. Any one of those is nothing. A pattern of them is a chart with pages missing. My mother rose first for the toasts, in pearl gray, and gave the performance of her career, warm, precise, every syllable load-tested. Two great medical families joining together. Standards upheld across generations. And then, to the whole room, she delivered the family's private catechism, freshly polished for export. People ask how our family produces what it produces, she said. The answer is simple. Everything in this family is earned. Our name most of all. Nothing at our table is given away for free. 200 glasses lifted to that. I kept my hands folded in my lap and heard, for the first time, the sentence buried underneath that sentence. She had said those exact words to me at the bottom of the wall, years ago. And somebody had almost certainly said them to her, in that same house, when she was small, a grandfather I never met, who reportedly graded his own daughter's posture at Sunday dinner. She wasn't quoting herself. She was reciting. The band played a few bars. Then the MC said the sentence that started the end of everything my family had spent 30 years building. And now, a few words from the groom. Ethan stood up holding a folded note card, thanked his parents, thanked his glowing bride, and then he set the card down and went off script, because he wanted, he said, to publicly thank the two people who'd made him the doctor standing there that night. The first is my mentor, he said. He taught me that trauma surgery is mostly just showing up, and then showing up again. Dr. Nathan Cole, Table 2. Applause. Every head at every Ashworth-adjacent table turned toward us like gun turrets. My mother's glass stopped an inch from her lips and simply did not move again. The second, Ethan went on, I only get to thank tonight because she's finally in the same room as me. I trained on a fellowship that funded my entire residency, named for a nurse, Dorothy Ashworth, who worked 4 decades of night shifts. It took me 2 years and one talkative colleague to find out who actually endowed it, because she wouldn't let the hospital print her name anywhere. No plaque. No gala seat. Nothing. He smiled, the easy smile of a man giving someone their due, with absolutely no idea what he was standing on top of. She built a company from nothing at 23. Half our hospital's discharges would collapse without her team. And she happens to be sitting right there next to my mentor, because she married him. Grace, Claire Whitmore. Would you stand up? Dorothy was her grandmother. The applause started warm and confused, 200 people turning in their chairs. I stood, because you stand when a good man asks you to. And out of the corner of my eye, in pearl gray, my mother rose out of her own chair too, not to clap. Her face had gone the color of old snow, and her mouth was already forming a word. There's been a mix-up, my mother said into a ballroom that had just heard the words her grandmother out loud. She said it with a hostess laugh bolted crookedly on top. Claire is a distant relation. It's a complicated situation, not one for tonight. And Natalie, my composed, laminated sister, chose that exact moment to lose 8 years of message discipline in a single blurt. You weren't invited, she said, loud, past the edge of the microphone, into 200 held breaths. The silence after that had texture to it. Ethan turned to his brand new wife slowly, the way you turn in a house where you've just heard something break upstairs. Not invited, he said. I invited her, Natalie. This is the woman who paid for my entire fellowship. This is my mentor's wife. Her grandmother's name is on the wall outside my office. How dare either of you? Do you have any idea who this woman is? She's the reason I'm standing here as a doctor. My mother, watching the whole structure come down around her, reached for the one lever she had left, rank. Ethan, dear, she said. This is a family matter. Which family? He said quietly, and somehow that landed harder than anything shouted could have. You could hear the chandelier hum in the silence after it. 200 guests, surgeons, hospital board members, an entire ecosystem my parents had spent 40 years performing for, looked back and forth between the bride, her mother, and the woman at table 2 they'd been told, in 100 small curated ways all evening, simply didn't exist. It was Ethan's mother, Dr. Diane Hargrove, chief of medicine at her hospital, who finished it. She rose from the head table without any hurry at all, in blue silk, 40 years of chairing difficult meetings behind her, and looked at my sister with the stillness of a diagnosis arriving. Natalie, she said. You told us you were an only child. Nobody answered her. That was the answer. My mother crossed the frozen room to me and took my forearm in both hands, the way you'd touch someone you'd always been close to, and set it at a volume calibrated to reach exactly the first 3 rows. Claire, darling. We'll discuss family matters privately. This is a wedding, darling. Darling. 8 years. A returned wedding invitation with "Don't embarrass yourself" written on the back in blue ink. A hospice visitor list with my name missing. And I'd graduated to darling in under a minute, now that there were witnesses worth performing for. Looking at her, this brilliant, exhausted woman gripping my arm like a railing, I felt something rise in me that wasn't rage. It was recognition. She still believed the story could be managed. She had no idea the manuscript had already left the building. So I smiled at her, the way you smile at someone shouting into a phone about a train stop they've already missed, and I said at once, gently, loud enough for the first 3 rows, and the microphone she'd apparently forgotten was still lit behind her. You have no idea, do you? She blinked. About what? About anything that's happened since I left, I said, and lifted her hands off my arm the way I used to lift Mr. Delgado's, firmly, kindly, no negotiation involved. I didn't list my company. I didn't say the word president, or mention 300 employees, or explain the fellowship. The resume was the one weapon I'd sworn I'd never reach for in front of them, because the moment I started arguing my own worth out loud, I was right back at the bottom of the wall, holding my accomplishments up toward an empty frame, waiting for someone to finally hang one. Instead, I turned to Diane Hargrove. Excuse me a moment, I said. This dress needs some air. And I walked toward the terrace doors with my spine straight. My mother followed me. She caught up to me in the stone corridor between the ballroom and the terrace, where the band's waltz came through the wall like weather. And there, my mother did the one genuinely surprising thing she'd done in 8 years. She dropped the performance entirely. No audience. No hostess polish. Just a 58-year-old woman in pearl gray with her back against a limestone wall, breathing like the air had suddenly become expensive. All right, she said. Here's what happens now. You come back inside. You tell the Hargroves we've always been close, quiet, private, but close. Say the fellowship was a family project. We'll say your father advised on it. And then you come home, Claire. Sunday dinners. All of it. Her voice caught, actually caught, on the next part. The frame gets filled. You've finally earned your place. And there it was, the door, wide open, everything I'd wanted at 19 arranged inside it like a table set for one. All I had to do was carry one lie across the threshold, and lying had always been the family business. I'd simply refused the apprenticeship. I looked at her hands while I let the offer sit there. They were trembling, the fine, relentless tremor she'd kept hidden under crossed arms all evening. The trimmer, I'd later learn, that had ended her own surgical career years ago, a failure she'd quietly outrun by becoming the family's judge instead of its performer. She saw me notice, and something old cracked open in her, just for one sentence. My father made me recite my class rank at that table every single Sunday until I left for college, she said, flat, almost like coordinates. I gave you a family that keeps score, because it's the only kind I was ever given. And it worked. Look at Natalie. We both heard it land at the same time. It worked, floating over a ballroom where Natalie's marriage was currently going into cardiac arrest. Her armor came back down like a curtain. Well, she said. The Hargroves are waiting. I looked down at Dot's watch, the 41 unfinished seconds sitting in my clutch beside it, and I smiled. No, I said. The frame stays empty. I built my own wall. I took Nathan's arm when I found him, nodded once to Ethan, thanked Diane Hargrove for a beautiful ceremony, and walked out of my sister's wedding through the center of the front doors, at the exact pace of a woman who had nowhere left she needed to be admitted to. Just before the doors closed behind us, I heard a single champagne glass hit the parquet floor. We didn't drive off dramatically. The valet line was 7 cars deep, and dynasties fall on their own schedule, not yours. So we walked out past the lit fountain to the far end of the terrace and stood in the cold spring dark, the party glowing gold through the glass behind us. That's when my hand finally started shaking. The honest kind. The kind you've actually earned. Nathan put his jacket over my shoulders and asked me nothing. I took out my phone. You already know the file. Gracie, it's your grandmother. Don't you dare delete this. I pressed play, and for the first time in 5 years, when her voice reached the 12-second mark, my thumb stayed down at my side, exactly where it belonged. And I need you to hear this, honey, because nobody ever told your mother, so she never learned how to say it to you. And somebody in this family has to go first. A breath on the line. The porch swing creaking somewhere underneath it. Nobody earns love, honey. Love is the one thing they can't bill you for. Whatever they do with that silly wall, you were never the empty frame, Gracie. You were the whole wall, and the house it's holding up. Don't you dare wait for people with ledgers to tell you what you're worth. Come see me Sunday. Bring nothing. Click. 41 seconds. 5 years to walk the last 12 of them. I cried then, the only time in this entire story, on a terrace, wrapped in my husband's jacket, my grandmother's watch ticking against my wrist like a second heartbeat. Not for the family I'd lost. You can't really lose something that was never issued to you in the first place. I cried for the woman who'd gone first, and for the 19-year-old standing at a mailbox years ago who could have used those 41 seconds a little sooner. When it was done, I did one small piece of housekeeping. I opened my holiday card list, found my parents' address sitting right at the top where it had sat for 8 years, and I deleted the entry. Then we went home. The rest of it collapsed over the following 6 weeks without any further help from me. Here's what the collapse looked like from a respectful distance, mostly through people who still liked me enough to keep me posted. The Hargroves did what careful, thorough families do after a wedding with a surprise sister in it. They went back and checked the chart. The dermatology practice with the fall grand opening had no lease on file anywhere, no license pending, no fall opening at all. Natalie's residency, it turned out, had ended halfway through her 2nd year. Not paused. Ended. The years since had been a string of medical-adjacent jobs, all of it wrapped carefully in our mother's narration. She had a diploma. She did not have a life printed on that wedding program. Ethan filed for an annulment about 6 weeks after the cake was cut. I'm told he handled it kindly, which sounds exactly like him, and that he kept the Dorothy Ashworth Fellowship listed proudly on his email signature, which undid me a little when I heard about it. My mother resigned her seat on the hospital's annual gala committee that fall, citing family obligations, a phrase doing far more work than any 4 words should have to do. Nobody fired her. Nobody needed to. Her currency had simply been devalued in every single room that had ever mattered to her, and she had built her entire adult life inside those rooms. That was the whole punishment, and it was total. My father sent me one email that November. No subject line. One sentence: your grandmother would have been proud of you. I read it maybe 30 times. I never wrote back. Both of those things are true at once, and I've stopped needing them to fight each other. And the wall, the original wall, back in that house 2.5 hours from my kitchen, still hangs there. 11 frames, and one still empty. Nobody's taken it down. Systems like that rarely come down all at once. They just quietly lose jurisdiction, one escaped person at a time. It doesn't reach me anymore. That's not quite the same thing as gone. I've made my peace with the difference. 6 months later, on an ordinary Sunday, I looked down my own dinner table and took inventory the way Dot used to count a pulse, unhurried, thorough, grateful. Nathan at the far end, arguing playoff brackets with Mr. Delgado's granddaughter. 3 of my very first caregivers, the ones who showed up back before Harbolite could even afford to pay them what they were worth. My first client's widow, who brings a pie nobody ever asks her to bring, and that everybody finishes anyway. And Ethan Hargrove, still a Dorothy Ashworth Fellow, still family somehow, the one thing I ended up keeping from that wedding without ever meaning to, telling a story with his fork waving around in the air. In our dining room, there are 11 frames on the wall too. I counted them one night and laughed until Nathan came to check on me. Ours hold a home care license, a photo of our first office above the laundromat, 2 wedding photos from a small backyard ceremony, and a nurse in a cardigan on a porch swing, mid-sentence, saying something the camera couldn't quite keep. Not one certificate. The watch stays on my wrist. The voicemail is still on my phone. These days, I can let it play all the way through while the potatoes boil. If a family ever made you audition for a seat at their own table, hear this. Love that has to be earned was never actually love. It was a job with no wages. And you're allowed to quit a job. The table you build afterward will hold every single person your old family's chairs never had room for. That's the story. 1 empty frame, 1 nurse's watch, and a voicemail that took 5 years to finish. If someone has ever made you feel like you had to earn your place in their life, take this as your sign to go build your own table instead. Share this with someone who needs to hear that today. Tell me in the comments about the table you built. And I'll see you in the next one.